Welcome. I'm Dean Reuter, Vice President, General Counsel, Director of Practice Groups at the Federalist Society. I'm very pleased to welcome you this morning to this, the best day of the National Lawyers Convention. You've chosen wisely if this is the only day you've been able to be here, but we did have a great evening last night at Union Station, and I hope you were able to attend. And I'm pleased to report that we'll be back at Union Station next year and for the next 3 years fully. So we won't be crossing that river to get to dinner anymore. And I promise we'll do a better job getting people into the building for the receptions in the evening. But I hope you enjoyed the talk from Justice Gorsuch last night as he reminded us that judges don't wear robes. They wear robes. Judges wear robes, not capes. That was a good line, but I thought his winning line really was, "Tonight I can report a person can be both a committed originalist and textualist and be confirmed to the Supreme Court of the United States." Now, as to what others are saying, this morning's headline, if you haven't seen it, is "Gorsuch takes victory lap at Federalist dinner." So I thought that was nice. And in that article, Politico describes the Gorsuch speech delivered to the Federalist Society as a triumphant moment for the organization. And I couldn't agree more. Yesterday morning when I opened the convention, I mentioned the record-setting crowd at the annual dinner, and indeed we have record-setting numbers each day of the convention. So you should congratulate yourselves on building such a strong and vibrant organization. And I'm speaking especially to those of you who can remember when we used to have sessions like this and breakout sessions in the very small meeting rooms upstairs. You should go up there, as I've done, and take a look at some of those tiny rooms. It's sort of like, after we've been filling these cavernous rooms for annual dinners and using the ballroom for all our events down here, it's kind of like visiting the giant slide you used to go down as a child. just doesn't look so big anymore. And my only fear about our success, frankly, and our attendance numbers at the convention is captured in an old saying that's usually attributed to Yogi Berra, and that's, "Nobody goes there anymore. It's too crowded." So I appreciate your patience in working with the crowds. But to begin this morning, we continue our theme, examining the regulatory state, with a showcase panel on Congress and the administrative state. Our moderator, Judge Diane Sykes of the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Second Circuit, really needs no introduction to this crowd. She's been doing volunteer work at this organization for years. She's a true friend of the Federalist Society. Please welcome Judge Sykes.
Thank you, Dean, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second showcase panel of this year's conference. Our topic this morning is Congress and the administrative state. Article 1 of the Constitution vests all legislative powers herein granted in Congress, but it has long been the case that lawmaking by administrative agencies overwhelmingly outpaces lawmaking by Congress, whether measured in terms of quantity or significance. Today, many of our federal laws are simply broad instructions to administrative agencies to make rules to govern vast areas of economic and social life in our country. Some of these laws were promulgated against the background assumption of a legislative veto, but in 1983, the Supreme Court declared the one-house legislative veto unconstitutional. Fast forward to the present day. We are now experiencing a renewed and intensified interest in establishing some congressional checks on the work of administrative agencies. This morning's panel will address the role of Congress in creating and controlling the administrative state. As always, the Federalist Society has assembled a distinguished group of experts in this field, and it's my honor to introduce them to you this morning. Keith Whittington will begin our discussion. He is here to my immediate right. He is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics at Princeton University. Professor Whittington is a widely published and award-winning scholar in the field of American constitutional theory and development, judicial politics, the presidency, and federalism. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Texas and a master's degree and PhD in politics from Yale University. Next, we'll hear from Christopher Walker, Associate Professor of Law at The Ohio State University's Moritz College of Law, where he teaches administrative law, constitutional law, legislation, state and local government, and a specialty course called The Ethics of Washington Lawyering. His professional experience includes work at the Kellogg-Huber firm here in Washington, D.C., and he has also worked in government at the Department of Justice and on Capitol Hill. Professor Walker earned a bachelor's degree at Brigham Young University, a master's degree in public policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and a law degree at Stanford Law School. He clerked for Judge Alex Kaczynski of the Ninth Circuit and for Justice Anthony Kennedy. Boyden Gray, to my immediate left, will continue our discussion this morning. He is well known to most of you. He is the founding partner of Boyden Gray and Associates, a law and strategy firm here in Washington that focuses on constitutional and regulatory issues. He has wide experience in government, including 12 years of service in the White House, first as counsel to the Vice President in the Reagan administration, and then as White House counsel to President George H.W. Bush. He later served as ambassador to the European Union under President George W. Bush. Between posts in the executive branch, Ambassador Gray practiced law at the Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering firm here in Washington and was an adjunct professor at the NYU School of Law. He holds degrees from Harvard and the University of North Carolina Law School. He served as a law clerk for Chief Justice Earl Warren. And finally, we'll hear from Peter Strauss, the Betts Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, where he teaches administrative law, legal methods, and legislation. Before entering the Legal Academy, Professor Strauss worked in the Solicitor General's office in the Department of Justice and served as a law clerk to Judge David Bazelon of the D.C. Circuit and as a law clerk to Justice William Brennan. He holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard and a law degree from Yale Law School. With that, I will turn the podium over to Professor Whittington.
So thank you. Thanks for turning out today. Feels like half my Twitter feed was here yesterday, and I'm glad to be able to join y'all this morning. I know it's a distinguished panel. I view myself as something of a warm-up act to get you to more interesting discussions about administrative law and the administrative state. I wanted to start off, though, on a somewhat pessimistic note in talking about the relationship between Congress and the administrative state. We often think about the administrative state in some ways as a runaway state, as a departure from Congress, as an indication of the bureaucracy taking power away from Congress. But instead, I want to suggest the ways in which Congress, in fact, has helped construct the administrative state, benefits from the administrative state, and prefers that the administrative state make a great deal of policy. And as a consequence, the ways in which courts over time have helped support that larger structure, and then the practical and political difficulties then of actually trying to chip away at the administrative state in any kind of very serious way. I do begin, though, with the normative starting point, which I think would be preferable if we would imagine Congress making clear statutory law. We'd be far better off if, in general, Congress were able to think through exactly what policies it wants the nation to follow, to be able to design relatively clear and specific statutes that would set out those policies. But we all know that it's very challenging for Congress to, in fact, make law, and that's been perhaps particularly obvious in recent months when Congress has the benefit of having both chambers and also the White House under same party control, although with relatively narrow majorities in the House and in the Senate, and yet still finds it extraordinarily difficult to successfully pass important pieces of legislation. And this has been true throughout American history. Law is very hard to make. And as a consequence, Congress often finds itself itself having difficulty making the policies directly that the nation wants and that even legislators themselves would like to have. Part of the value of making law, though, is that Congress is collectively representative of national interest as a whole. Congressmen come from the people. They represent a wide variety of views and perspectives and interests and constituencies across the nation. Ideally, at least, part of the virtue of Congress is it provides a single forum in which those interests and constituencies can work out their disagreements and come to some common solutions. Moreover, it's attractive that Congress is accountable to the people. So when Congress is actually able to make policy, not only do they deliberate among themselves and reach some accommodations among the competing interests that are represented in the legislature itself, but ultimately if the people are unhappy with the policies that Congress is making, it's possible for the people to turn them back and force Congress to take a different path. So there are some virtues in having an institution like a representative elected legislature make fundamental policy decisions, but at the end of the day, it's very challenging for a legislature to make those policy decisions. It's challenging in the United States, it's at the federal level, it's challenging at the state level, and it's challenging in other countries as well. Legislatures struggle in the modern context to make serious policy decisions. Some of these concerns and challenges are simply practical. It's hard to reach agreement in legislatures, and so while it would be nice if Congress were to make clear and precise statutes in which they think through the trade-offs that need to be made and made some decisive conclusions about what policy we ought to pursue, it's very hard for Congress to actually come to agreement on what those ought to look like. As we've seen, Congress is also very slow in making decisions, and to the extent that we think that policy might need to change relatively rapidly, that society in the world changes fairly rapidly. It's problematic if we have a primary policymaker that can be relatively slow to make adjustments over time and to grapple with the new realities. And moreover, Congress has limited expertise. Congress is designed to be a body of generalists, and while they can staff up and in fact develop particular expertise for individual members, at the end of the day, there's a limit as to just how much knowledge and expertise Congress actually has, and as a consequence, what kind of quality the legislative output can actually look like. Moreover, there are political challenges to Congress making some of these fundamental policy decisions, and that is Congress, as elected representatives, have a great desire to pass the buck. They would prefer not to take the blame for hard policy choices, although they would like to claim credit for easy policy choices. And so as much as possible, as a consequence, they will avoid having to make hard choices and instead pass them off to somebody else to make when they can, and that somebody else often is the administrative state. As a consequence, the administrative state has long been an attractive solution to some of these congressional problems from the perspective of Congress itself, and Congress has been very enthusiastic about building up an administrative state, as have state legislatures at the state level, and passing off power to them. Statutes are written with very broad delegations of power to administrative agencies, giving administrative agencies a lot of room to roam, allowing lots of important choices to be made by executive officials rather than have those choices be made by Congress itself. Congress has tools available to it, and we'll hear more about them, I think, in order to engage in some oversight of what those administrative agencies are doing. But there's lots of political incentives to minimize that oversight and engage in it only in a somewhat limited way, and instead allow the administrative agencies to mostly do the work on their own. And moreover, Congress has some incentives to engage in the blame game in this regard as well, in that to the extent that Congress doesn't like what the bureaucracy is doing, it can always complain to its constituents about the evils of the bureaucracy, while to the extent that the bureaucracy does something that Congress likes, congressmen can claim credit for those activities as well. So there's some virtue of having some serious policy making be done at an arm's length relationship from Congress itself. And the courts have, over time, recognized this reality, and instead of obstructing the administrative state and constraining the extent to which the administrative state can be created, courts throughout American history have tended to facilitate the development of the administrative state. And here I want to draw a bit on some joint work I did with a co-author, a Princeton graduate student, and a Harvard JD, Jason Giuliano. We have a piece in Notre Dame Law Review coming out, and recent piece in Law Review, looking at the history of non-delegation doctrine, both in the states' courts and in the federal courts across American history. We have a common story that we like to tell ourselves, that the non-delegation doctrine, the doctrine that legislature cannot delegate away its core powers to other actors, in particular to administrative agencies, and as a consequence, courts could ensure and should look closely at the extent to which Congress has tried to delegate away its constitutional authority. We have a common story that non-delegation doctrine was once a quite serious obstacle to the administrative state and actually constrained what Congress did. And it was only during the course of the New Deal that we moved away from that more classical commitment to a serious non-delegation doctrine to something like we have today, in which the courts are very deferential to Congress and to the delegation of authority. I think for the most part that's a myth. Courts were never very concerned with restricting what legislatures have done, and that did not change dramatically with the New Deal. Courts today behave much as they did throughout the 19th century and early 20th century as well, and have mostly facilitated the passing of policy decision-making from the legislatures to other political actors. And notably, that's true even in the states, where often there are, in fact, pieces of constitutional text. They're specifically designed to limit the ability of legislatures to delegate authority to other political actors, unlike the U.S. Constitution, in which courts have largely worked on implicit assumptions built into the document in order to support the non-delegation doctrine. At the state level, there's constitutional text that actually supports it. Nonetheless, state courts, like federal courts, have tended to be quite deferential. And they've been deferential because they didn't see that there was much practical alternative. So as the Michigan Supreme Court said in 1854, for example, it's the very nature of the legislative power to be delegated. You couldn't expect a legislature to actually have to make hard policy decisions on its own. It was always going to have to pass off those policy decisions to other actors. At the state level, it's often a wide set of actors that legislatures are passing power off to, not just administrative agencies. And early in the 19th century, courts were sometimes skeptical when legislatures handed off power to one particular set of actors, and that is voters. Courts were very skeptical about the extent to which voters should be able to exercise something like the legislative power. And so when state legislatures wanted to use the referendum mechanism to hand off power to voters, state courts would sometimes, although not always, object to that. But to the extent that over the course of the 19th century, legislatures instead started to turn to administrative agencies and executive branch officials to exercise that kind of policy discretion, courts were often very enthusiastic about it and thought that was exactly the kind of delegation of legislative authority that legislatures needed to make. So, for example, as the Minnesota Supreme Court said in 1888, looking at one of the regulatory delegations that its own legislature had made to a new independent regulatory commission, the court emphasized that legislatures have to be able to delegate policy authority. Otherwise, they would be helplessly entangled in the meshes of their own constitution. And at the end of the day, the people wanted the government to be successful. It wanted the government to be able to take practical action to advance the people's needs. And if we were going to avoid being hopelessly entangled in the meshes of the Constitution, that would ultimately mean we needed to delegate to experts. And courts were often very comfortable with the idea of legislatures leaning heavily on the experts that they could find in the executive branch and administrative agencies, even when those experts were given very little guidance as to what they should be doing with the policymaking authority that they'd be granted. So this is a fairly pessimistic take on the administrative state. We've built the administrative state over a very long period of time. Congress has been very active in helping to build the administrative states, and the courts have, throughout our history, been willing to facilitate the building of the administrative state and the delegation of broad authority. So it remains a serious challenge as to how you chip away at that, how you embed some accountability in the administrative state, and how we can return to a Congress that, at least to some degree, exercises some serious policymaking authority. Thank you.
if you're not following Keith on Twitter, you are really missing out. Lots of wit and snark, but also a lot of really important commentary on the world today. I want to start, if I can get some slides up, I want to start where Senator Cotton kicked us all off yesterday by saying that we live in a world where lawmaking is predominantly done by regulation. Gone are the days where common law might have predominated or where statutes predominated. And when I teach my first-year law students in legislation and regulation, when I introduce them to the administrative state, I like to start with a Facebook post from Senator Lee from 2014. Apparently, he collects all of the pages of the Federal Register for the year, and that's those 3 columns there. And on top of it are the public laws that Congress passed in 2013. Now, this is a little deceptive. Those that know the Federal Register, it includes all notices and proposed rules, not just final rules. And so this is a little bit exaggerated. And Congress, of course, doesn't include its committee reports and the like, and all the legislative materials it relied on in public laws. But it's really actually not that far off, if I can get the clicker to work. If I can go to, all right, there we go. So if we're looking at the last 2 years of Congress passed 329 laws. Agencies promulgated over 7,000 rules, 3,000 pages in the statute of large for Congress, over 60,000 pages in the Federal Register on final rules, with nearly 180,000 pages total. So there's really not a debate here about who's making more laws or where most of the restrictions that are placed upon us by the federal government come from. I love the Mercatus Center has this amazing fun new project called the QuantGov Regulatory Clock. They've gone to the Code of Federal Regulations, which is similar to the U.S. Code, but for regulation. So not what's coming out every year, but what exists in the federal regulatory state. And there are over 100 million words in the Code of Federal Regulation. They've estimated over 1 million regulatory restrictions, and that if the average full-time employee had to read the whole Federal Code of Federal Regulations, it would take almost 3 years. So we've got a lot of work to do if we want to try to understand what constrains us at the federal level by federal agencies. And this year, 3 kind of related experiences made me think more deeply about the role that Congress should play in the modern administrative state. And I want to kind of just briefly sketch out all 3, and then in the Q&A we can dive in a little bit deeper on this. So the first half of this year, I took leave from the law school to work in the Senate on the Gorsuch confirmation and for Senator Hatch on regulatory reform. And one piece of legislation we worked a lot on is the Regulatory Accountability Act, the Senate version, the one that actually has a couple Democrats. I'd call it bipartisan. I think it is bipartisan, but we've only got so far Heitkamp and Manchin on board. What this legislation does, most of what this legislation does is pretty common sense recommendations that the American Bar Association of all has been supporting for years, and the Administrative Conference of the United States. And we can kind of talk through some of these later, but my point is the main talking point of the controversy here is the last one. And the last one is that for any rules that cost $100 million or more, and especially for rules that cost $1 billion or more, the legislation would amend the Administrative Procedure Act to require formal rulemaking, or a variant of formal rulemaking, where you actually have live testimony, where you cross-examine witnesses, where you get a chance to really challenge this. And I somewhat agree with the critics that this would perhaps encourage a little more ossification on these huge rules, especially the billion-dollar rules. But the fact that, like, the senators on the right are even trying to bless rules of $1 billion tells us how far we've strayed from Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution that says that all legislative powers granted herein shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. We're actually now saying, well, except for these ones, we can have a trial, right? Not saying it's a bad idea. It might also lead to ossification, but I think it's really in our public discourse and how Congress sees its role, it's really telling that we've got a number of senators, Republican senators, that are willing to embrace and finally just kind of bless this system of lawmaking done by federal agencies. So that's my point number one. My second point is this year I've thought a lot about a terrific new book by Josh Chaffetz called Congress's Constitution. Josh Chaffetz is not to be confused with the former member of Congress, former or still? Is he former? But with the law professor at Cornell. And he gives a fascinating deep dive into the tools that Congress has to constrain the administrative state. Now, of course, he frames this more in competing in a public sphere and the separation of powers with the president. But these tools are really, really powerful, and I highly recommend you go read the book, or if you want the free abbreviated version, I've got a summary of it in my Michigan Law Review book review that's a draft is on SSRN. But to kind of give you the really short version, he identifies these 6 tools, and identifies anyone who's worked in Congress already knows about these tools. But what makes it such a fun and interesting book is he provides the historical foundations for these tools, shows how they were used in England before the formation of the United States, and traces how they've been used over the years by Congress here in the United States. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the tools that allow Congress to oversee the federal administrative include the power of the purse, the appropriations process with annual reviews of discretionary funding, really powerful tool. The personnel power, we see this front and center right now through the appointments process. Senators are able to extract concessions and commitments from the administration when they're reviewing individuals that have been nominated to run federal agencies. There's the contempt of Congress power. We've seen that used in the last decade, or at least the threat of it used in the last decade, to gather information, to change agency behavior and the like. And then you've got these soft powers like the freedom of speech and debate. He makes a really fun, I think, brilliant point. I thought, well, how does this help you control the federal administrative state? Well, it allows Congress to make information public that otherwise agencies haven't released for confidentiality reasons or even from a secrecy perspective. And just the threat of making it public is enough to get concessions to constrain, to rein in the administrative state. And then the last 2 are internal discipline and cameral rules. And in the review, I spent a lot more time on this, but this is where you get a lot. The cameral rules in particular is where Congress gets a lot of its power to oversee the modern administrative state. In particular, it's created standing committees to provide oversight. It's given staff members deposition authority and subpoena authority to investigate the administrative state. And so these tools, and I agree with Josh Chaffetz, these tools are an extremely powerful toolbox that we have to interact with the administrative state. And to try to kind of influence the breadth and the direction that federal agencies go in on a daily basis. Now, what he expressly does not talk about in the book, and I think it's wise, the book's already quite ambitious, is actually legislating. There's nothing in the book about legislating. And that's depressing to me. And as I've thought about the book and these tools, I've thought, all of these tools here, they're in the Constitution, but they're all there to support Section 1 of Article 1, to legislate. You collect information, you have contempt power, you hold these hearings, you have oversight of agencies, not to just oversee them and to make sure, but to actually figure out what they're doing wrong and correct course. At least that's the argument I have. And if Congress isn't substantively legislating on a regular basis, I think the validity, or at least the wisdom of these tools is called into question as a standalone mechanism for controlling the modern administrative state. And I don't raise this concern writing on a blank slate. It turns out for decades, positive political theorists have been talking about this, that there are costs to legislating clearly, that the collective Congress has incentives to delegate to committees to do most of the legislative drafting, and even at the committee level, because folks have to run for re-election and address constituents' concerns and satisfy donors, they don't spend as much time on legislating either, so statutes are more ambiguous than they would need to be. And that's okay, at least according to some positive political theorists, because they got these tools. On the back end, Congress can come back in and say, agency, and when I say Congress, I mean individual members of Congress or committees, not the collective Congress, can come back in and impose their policy preferences on the agencies by threatening to do oversight. Naomi Rao, who's the wire administrator, and I have both written separately about the problems and the dangers of this from an administrative collusion perspective. Her argument is that the individual members of Congress, the committees, have incentives to collude with agencies, to leave statutes ambiguous, to delegate a lot of authority so they can work out a deal on the back end. My argument's a little bit weaker because Naomi's a lot stronger than I am. My argument is that because agencies play a substantial role in drafting the legislation, and because Congress doesn't care about making legislation clear because they have other things they need to do, agencies are able to play an undue influence in actually designing the legislation that gives them the power to do what they want to do. So that's kind of my second observation. And the third is, I'll throw the question, what's the greatest legislative achievement Congress has done this year? And it's not something they've actually enacted, not tax reform like through the House. I don't think it's a close call. It's the Congressional Review Act resolutions, right? Now, I think we can learn a lot from the Congressional Review Act resolutions. The first I would say is that, boy, this is proof that there's a democratic deficit in agency rulemaking. All right? Huge rules, Congress, new administration, at least 15 have now been approved resolutions. So it shows that these rulemaking on these major rules, so 100 million and the like, that there are problems from a democratic and accountability deficit perspective. On the flip side, man, if this is the best Congress can do, not too excited. This is a reactive Congress to the administrative state, not a proactive one, right? This isn't a Congress that identifies problems and tries to solve them and uses agencies to implement their policy choices. This is a reactive Congress that tells agencies not to do anything anymore. Still a good tool, still constitutional. Some administrative law scholars would disagree. But it's not a Congress taking its Article I legislative responsibilities seriously. So what would it look like if Congress started to actually legislate again? Well, I would say I would use lowercase legislation, do oversight, actually do the reauthorization process of the organic statutes that govern federal agencies, respond through legislation to how agencies are acting. For instance, I think Chevron deference would be a far less problematic doctrine if Congress was actually playing its role in legislating and adjusting the statutory mandates in response to aggressive agency interpretations. I've done a fair amount of empirical work at federal agencies surveying federal agency rule drafters, and they respond quite strongly to threats of judicial deference being less. If just the threat of Congress trying to legislate in areas where agencies are doing stuff under Chevron deference would make that a much more restrained federal administrative state on the interpretive front. Now, I just spent 6 months in the Senate. I am not going to stand up here and say that we're going to see an Article I renaissance anytime soon. It's not going to happen. But that doesn't mean we as scholars and lawyers and thought leaders shouldn't be demanding it. That's how the conversation starts. And I can tell you, and I'll end on this, when the arbitration, the CFPB rule, was invalidated through the Congressional Review Act process, the administrative law professor listserv, which is a wild place to be these days, one of the predominant themes, not shared by everyone, but shared by quite a few, was this, and I'm taking an anonymous quote, if I get to it. To me, this shows the invalidation of this Congressional Review Act resolution, how outrageous the Congressional Review Act can be. The CFPB, in its congressionally mandated study, provided voluminous justification for consumer protection rule, in which helps the proverbial little guy. Yet 50 senators in a subsequent Congress can kill it without having to explain why. That is what a first-year law student is learning these days about the interaction between the modern administrative state and Congress. That Congress, through both houses and the president, cannot invalidate a rule that an agency had promulgated. I tell you, we've got to do a lot better work in this room on educating lawyers about our representative democracy and the role that the modern administrative state should play. This is a big problem, and I don't think we're going to solve it tomorrow. Congress isn't going to get up and start legislating, but it won't even start to think about how to do that unless we start talking more about Congress's proper role under the Constitution.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak here. You've just heard two very good surveys of Congress's abdication. I want to make a general point to start with that, as our last speaker said, we need to condition the public a lot better about what's going on here. I think what good Trump is doing is going to be reflected in the economy, is being reflected in the economy, but beyond the kind of people in this room, I don't know that the average citizen really understands it. And until the average citizen really understands it and pressures his or her representative in Congress, we're going to get the kind of congressional response that is needed. And so we need to make this more well understood. There's sort of two ways of looking at it. One is ridicule. I remember one of the great ads in the beginning of in the campaign that Reagan ran, which helped condition the groundwork. There were lots of good ads, but OSHA had enacted a stupid rule that said you had to have a potty every 500 acres, on a ranch or something, and not that there weren't enough bushes to use. And the ad that Wallop ran, which was so effective, I thought, I still remember it. It was an ad that showed this Marlboro man, very handsome guy on a really good-looking horse, just about to chew up the world. And what was he doing as he crossed across the screen? He was dragging a potty. And we need more like this. I was going over some of the research of state licensing laws, which are horrible, and the Institute of Justice has done a great job. Clint Bolick, and go to his website, and you can see a lot of fun things. And one of the issues is braiding. You've got to have, be a certified cosmetologist to braid hair. And this young research associate, a woman, started braiding her hair. And I screamed at her, stop, stop, stop. You're going to get me thrown in jail. You're not certified. You're not certified. And so she stopped. She obeyed me, which was, think of a thought project. This may be getting ahead of my own talk, but think of a thought puzzle that might get this ball really rolling and get Congress really acting. Think of said the administrator of EPA, instead of exploiting an ambiguity in a statute to claim that as a delegation of unending authority, think of the administrator saying, this thing is just too plain open-ended. It's supposed to be the navigable waters of the United States. And I don't care how hard it rains, I've never been able to use my rowboat in my backyard. And I really don't understand this. And I'm just simply not going to enforce this law until Congress passes a definition that I can work with. And I can't work with the waters of the United States. I don't know what the heck does that mean? And then, of course, there'd be litigation, and the issue would be joined about the non-delegation doctrine and this, that, and the other. But think of, I think we have to do something drastic like that in order to get more attention to the problem. Now, the source, in my view, the source of the problem is ambiguity, and ambiguity is the license for delegation. And the standards that are used for deference, there's research done by these two previous speakers, is really stunning, the data about how much an agency wins depending on what the standard is. And it's directly related, obviously, has nothing to do with the merits, just with the standard. And that's not, I think, the way this country should be governed. Now, what is the reason why we have such ambiguous, loosey-goosey statutes today? Well, there's a theory, Naomi Rao and others have theorized, described in some of the work done by my two colleagues up here, that it's administrative collusion. The Congress goes to the agencies asking for technical help, which the agencies, of course, have, But the agencies respond by drafting very loose language, which allows them the authority to exploit loopholes to ever expand their authority. And the poor Congress is sort of left there not knowing quite what to do. Then there's the lobbying incentive. There's one note in one of the Federalist Society research programs that's ongoing now. A lobbyist goes in, or a constituent goes in to try to stop some stupid licensing bill, and is told, you know, money talks here, and you have to have a paid lobbyist to represent you. Now, why would they do that? Well, because that's where they're going to go after they leave the state legislature. They're going to want to be paid lobbyists. So it's in their interest to have paid lobbyists. Well, that's something we could take care of. I think there is the question on the administrative collusion of using it as a form of illegitimate legislative veto, actually, to shake down donors, leaving things vague so that the donor has to go to them and say, well, can you help me with agency X, Y, or Z, and we'll charge you a small commission in the form of a campaign donation. I think that goes on all the time. I once, when I was in the White House, suggested that we could stop some of this if we required agencies to log visits by congressmen the way they require notice of visits by people like me going in and lobbying. And I made this suggestion, and it took Dan Quayle, Vice President Quayle, about 30 seconds to get to my office and threaten my resignation if I didn't cut this silliness out of requiring Congress to log its own implications before federal agencies. So it's never really happened, but there's no reason why it shouldn't happen and it couldn't happen to slow the Congress down. There is no reason why Congress can't do its work, but I would say that the biggest problem is simply the 2.5-day work week. It used to be, when I first came to Washington, that congressmen and senators would usually spend the weekend. They get time off. They get plenty of time to go back to their districts, but normally they'd stay over the weekend, and they'd end up in parent-teacher conferences together, PTA meetings, and, you know, golfing over the weekends across the aisle. They all kind of knew each other. Now they don't know each other, and so there's no trust. There's no common discussion. Dinner parties used to be great. Used to be great dinner parties. You could get senators, you could get congressmen. Today, you can't have a dinner party with a senator or a congressman because they're only here 1 or 2 nights a week, and when they are here, they're down there voting, and the voting isn't always happy. Congressman Massey tells a story about, you know, in the Senate you call a roll because there are only 100. In the House, you got to use these voting cards and punch yes or no. And after a bleary day of pushing in his punch card, he takes his wife and children out to dinner, and another couple, and he absentmindedly gives the waitress at the end his voting card. And he could tell out of the corner of his eye that he didn't put himself in that position to see, but he could, in fact, and the card kept being spit out by the machine. He was, oh my God, do I have a valid, where's my other credit card? And it turned out he could pay. And before she left, though, he said, Madam, it's all worked out, but what was wrong with my first card? And she said, well, mister, it had $19 trillion on it, and we thought that was a little too... Congress can buckle down. And in the old days, I would use, and of course it's personal to me because I was involved in it, in the 1990 amendments, but I do know something to the Clean Air Act, so I do know something about it. It was one of the most sweeping environmental statutes ever passed. It didn't It didn't stop the greatest boom the country's ever enjoyed, perhaps since the 1880s. It certainly didn't slow the economy down. It went into exquisite detail, even though it was only 300 pages long compared to Dodd-Frank, which is 2,000 pages. And there was an inordinate amount of detail in it. And Dingell never would delegate an inch of discretion to EPA. He just wouldn't do it. He put the grams per mile in the statute. And if you go back and look at it, it's astonishing, really. The acid rain trading program, this loosey-goosey thing where, utilities can trade their obligations back and forth. The baseline requirements for reductions are listed not just utility by utility, but within each utility, pipe by pipe. In the legislation, the numbers, 240 tons a year. I mean, amazing. And this legislation did take 2 years, but that's often faster than ordinary rulemaking. And it was enormously efficient. I had a NRDC guy tell me it's saved more lives than any other single thing Congress has ever done. You don't need an agency to do this. Congress has plenty of access to the expertise to do it, and they did it in this act. And it produced huge, huge health benefits, and as far as anyone can tell, no economic downside. So we know Congress can do it. They just are not doing it anymore. But it couldn't have been done on a 2.5-hour work week. One solution to this, of course, is just simply to take the money away. That is, don't give congressmen the money to go home on the weekends. And except for the very, very rich, you know what? They won't go home on the weekends. So trap them here, What are some of the other remedies for this? I think the Accountability Act that you saw summarized would be a huge advantage. I think I want to emphasize that part of it is cost-benefit codification, and I think cost-benefit analysis is extremely important, not just for regular agencies as it is now, more or less required by the executive order, but also for independent agencies, and there's no legal reason why that shouldn't happen. We didn't do it back in 1981 simply because those agencies, some of the banking agencies and the FCC, weren't that important. It wasn't that critical to raise a political storm. Now, they control really the biggest parts of the economy, high tech and finance, and so they should be brought under the same rules. And cost-benefit analysis doesn't hurt to do. It really does not hurt to do. And courts know how to do it. We've seen it. Judge Ginsburg did it in the Business Roundtable SEC case. It can happen. There's no reason why we should be scared of doing it. It's a great sort of backup for over-delegation, because it says this is where you stop. This is where you have to stop. You can't, this is the stopping place. And, but Congress has to enact it. The American trucking case, Scalia makes clear that an agency can't provide its own antidote to the non-delegation doctrine. That's something only Congress, only the judges can do if Congress hasn't done it. The REINS Act hasn't been mentioned. That's where a rule doesn't go into effect until Congress positively adopts it and the president signs it. And that's thought to be quite radical by some people. But I would, but it's not a new idea. Professor Stewart and Justice Breyer were suggesting it a decade ago or more. It didn't get enacted then, but it's not new and it's not without good parentage. And if you look again at the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, a REINS Act, that is a REINS Act right there. The act is a REINS Act. It's what could Congress do? That's what Congress could do. It could take what EPA might have produced and enact it. And in a sense, the detail that's in the REINS Act, in the Clean Air Act, is a kind of analogous REINS Act requirement of enacting the rulemaking of a federal agency. I think that, as I said, cutting the pay of, or cutting the travel allowance would also help a great deal and keep these guys here and make them work 5 days a week. I mean, we do. It used to be, indeed, even 6 days a week. And the added benefit is that it will revive somebody like Joe Alsup. Some of you may be old enough here to remember him. Somebody like him will reappear if he can invite senators to dinner, and then he'll start throwing people out of the House for making outrageous statements about the Vietnam War or the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War, and life would become a lot more fun in Washington if you had this kind of behavior. And I would finish with saying that I think American trucking, the first case really to raise non-delegation since the 30s. Most people think it didn't come out well. I think it made some very, very important points, and just go over them very, very quickly. The most important being, if you have a non-delegation, a colorable non-delegation claim, Chevron and Auer go out the window. They're not relevant. The agency does not interpret the statute in a non-delegation situation. Only the judges can interpret the statute. Now that is a huge opening. I think it's bigger than the Burwell opening, bigger than the major question opening. It's never been really exploited, but it should be. The case stands for the proposition that the canon of non-delegation, which has been written about by Sunstein at some length, it does live. I mean, Justice Scalia did rewrite the statute to make it, to bring it within the manageable standards that did put a stopping point on what EPA could do. This has not been well understood, but the Solicitor General, who told me that this case scared him more than any other thing he ever did in government, rejected EPA's refusal to accept any change and wrote in a change that was based on something that the Solicitor General said at the oral argument. It is actually a cite to the transcript of the oral argument, which doesn't happen very often. And then finally, on cost benefit, Scalia says no cost benefit for the national standard, but on implementation, which is the important part, when you implement it at the state level, it's a Federalist-based statute. When you implement at the state level, cost benefit is perfectly appropriate, and if the costs and benefits don't add up, the state doesn't implement the SIP, the State Implementation Plan. So there's plenty in that case, and there's some subsequent cases, plenty for, as Justice Gorsuch said last night, there's plenty of action possible for that very dirty word, delegation. Thank you.
Well, I really also appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and feel for myself, probably you'll recognize, because I'm out of uniform, that I am the House Liberal on the stage here. The way in which the Federalist Society organizes these meetings, to be sure you hear several points of view, has to me consistently been a strength of your organization and the way in which it proceeds. I have a slide show too. There you go. And I'm going to do something that you'll find eccentric, but if you use PowerPoint, I want to recommend it to you. I don't know how to use this thing, the clicker. But what I do is I keep a numbered list of my slides. And then I'm not going to be able to do it. The folks in the back will do it for me. I just enter the number of the slide that I want. and it goes straight to that slide. You don't have to go zipping back and forth trying to find the slide. Anyway, if you would put up slide 13, please. There you go. So here's the actor that hasn't really been mentioned so far in today's panel, and understandably, Congress is the word in the title of the panel. But it strikes me that one of the ways to think about the difficulties that we have in legislation, which have been so well understood, is that we do not have a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system, legislative proposals are, first of all, drafted by the government, not by people like Boyden, paid lobbyists. Sorry. And then when they get to Parliament, well, there's a majority of the folks who drafted them sitting in Parliament, but there can be, in the back and forth within the party, an understanding about the level of detail that you need to get to in order to have sensible legislation. And so one more frequently gets legislation in some detail, or an exercise of the responsibility that the legislatures have to be as clear as they can be. And they often can't be all that clear, but still as clear as they can be, because the government as a whole is in fact directly responsible. Whereas both the president and the Congress can escape political responsibility, in effect, for inadequate legislation, and the president, if it's his agencies making the rulemaking, can be quite happy with what comes out. There's also this issue, and there's question time in parliamentary governments, and a fair amount of visibility. Boyden's remark about his conversation with Vice President Quayle reminded me of something that happened when I was general counsel of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which gave me a nice view of the relationship of agencies and both the President and Congress. Shortly after the Government and the Sunshine Act had been enacted, Senator Gary Hart, a classmate of mine at Yale, called and said he wanted the commission to come and meet in his office in order to discuss the Rocky Flats plant that was out there in Colorado and that was threatening his Colorado constituents. And we wrote back and said, that would be fine. Could we, just tell us the date and we'll announce it in the Federal Register, because this will be a meeting of the commission. It will not surprise you to learn that the meeting was never held. So one reason for putting this up in front of you is, before I get to specifics, I want to share three concerns with you. And the first of them is this one, right? That how much authority does the president have? Not those agencies to whom the authority is delegated, but the president. And I realize this isn't the place where this issue is to be addressed. But there was a nice equivalent, a nice illustration of the difficulty given by Justice Jackson at the very end of his opinion in Youngstown Sheet and his concurring opinion in Youngstown Sheet and Tube. And now could we have slide 2, please? Which I find both extremely persuasive and in some respects threatening, because from my perspective as an administrative law professor, and any of you who've read my stuff know that this has long been my perspective, that it's the growth of power in the presidency, to which the dysfunctionality of Congress has contributed, that is the largest threat to our political freedoms and liberty. A second concern I have is about things that reduce Congress's incentive to legislate as carefully as it can. We'd all want Congress to legislate as carefully as it could, but sometimes it does things that reduce that incentive. And I'm going to suggest to you that the REINS Act is one of those things. when I get around to that. And finally, and this also is connected to the REINS Act and to the Regulatory Accountability Act, at least in its House version, I have a concern with actions that appear more likely to provide tools for obstruction than genuine process gain. And here I'd like slide 3. Boyden and many of you are concerned with delegation, with Congress's failure to decide important issues, and I do get that. There's a political reality behind the failure of judges to enforce the delegation doctrine as it is conventionally stated, and that political reality is that they're the weakest branch. And getting into a running fight with the legislature about whether they've legislated precisely enough, go back, do it again, go back, do it again, go back, do it again, is not a recipe for a continued success and support. But we do have a delegation doctrine. Boyden mentioned it, Cass Sunstein has written about it, and it's Justice Scalia's "I won't find elephants in mouse holes." It's the clear statement doctrine. It's the variety of ways in which courts can and do and should fail to find authority for surprising things in legislation that is not very carefully worded. And I suppose none of us have any difficulty with that. Okay, so with that, I want to spend a few words talking about these two proposed statutes. REINS first, and that's slide 4, please. Now we're actually getting into a kind of order, and if I knew how to use the clicker, I would, but I don't. Well, one more. This, so it replaces, and there are going to be a series of, hit the return button, please. It replaces completely the Congressional Review Act. It has resource implications for the bipartisan GAO, which, by the way, Josh Chaffetz does not mention as a tool of Congress in his book, but my judgment, it's a really important one. So if the REINS Act were to take effect, GAO would need a lot more people in order to do the work it's supposed to do. It limits the impact of congressional actions depriving rules of effect. This for me is this thing that is most affirmatively in its favor. Under the Congressional Review Act as it now is, a disapproval of a rule, an unexplained disapproval of a rule, results in the subtraction from the agency's authority of the ability ever to adopt a similar rule, a substantially similar rule, unless Congress enacts a statute authorizing it, which you'll understand there's a lot of profound veto gates there. In the REINS Act, if major rules are not approved, okay, stop, now you can stop hitting because I want to stay with this for a while. If major rules are not approved, they can be resubmitted to the next Congress. And disapproval of a non-major rule has no effect whatever on agency authority. This seems to me to be a wise change. A wise change in part because, well, let's go to that last of the adoptions of the Congressional Review Act that Chris mentioned. Okay, a very narrow majority disapproved the arbitration rule. Do we think that they were reflecting, that every one of those 50 senators was reflecting the view that his constituents would have had about the virtue or lack of virtue of a rule protecting consumer interests against large moneyed interests? Or do we think that there's a chance that at least one of those votes, and I suppose probably more, was the product of where the money comes from, rather than what my constituents would wish for themselves. The Congressional Review Act votes don't have to be explained, and they can come from whatever special interest is able to persuade the senator, the representative, that they ought to vote in that way. The REINS Act has some protection against veto gates. It could be improved. It has maybe an unnecessary extension of the time for action when one goes between the first and second sessions of a particular Congress. I can't think of a reason why one needs to extend the time for congressional action, but perhaps. Okay, now the next slide, if you will. Particular weaknesses, particularly, especially in relationship to the delegation concern. Hit the next slide, please, 5. It preserves intensive judicial review. Well, why? If Congress is in effect enacting a statute, shouldn't it be treated as a statute? And in preserving intensive judicial review, isn't it in effect saying, oh, well, it's still the agency engaging in rulemaking, it's not something for which we're taking responsibility? We'll let the courts figure out whether the agency has been sufficiently responsible or not. Paul Verkyle made an argument for a similar statute in the past, but he was clear that the approval mechanism should be traded for hard-look review and would produce more intelligent action on the part of the Congress. I don't have constitutional problems with the REINS Act, as my friend Ron Levin expressed in an interesting piece that some of you may have seen in the George Washington Law, volume 83 of the George Washington Law Review. I think Congress could, if it wished, pass a statute that amended every agency's rulemaking authority by saying it only goes up to this point and no farther. If you want to go farther than that, it has to be done by statute. Okay, but we aren't going to get Clean Air Act amendments of 300 pages or 2,000-page Dodd-Frank statutes every day. You saw that wonderful slide of Chris's comparing the size of the Federal Register with the code. And so real implications for Congress's resources in trying to do something like that. It's not at all clear to me that enacting REINS will cause more careful drafting of agency authority, in part because you don't have to explain what you're doing. Chevron is what makes careful drafting important. Chevron properly understood, and I agree that Chevron properly understood, includes careful judicial attention to just how much authority does this agency have. That is to say, no elephants in mouse holes. Sensible, contemporary, actual non-delegation doctrine. And now the next slide. We're talking about Senate. Next slide, please. We're talking about Senate REINS. If one looks at the House bill, one sees issues that make the bill quite a bit more problematic from my perspective. It embodies President Trump's Executive Order 13771. Well, actually, one thing to notice about that is it embodies it as a congressional statement, and the president is never mentioned, and the president is given no authority. One of the difficulties with the current cost-benefit analysis regime, in my judgment, and this goes back to the Clinton administration, this is slide 9, is that, slide 9, please. Section 8 of Executive Order 12866 has not been much thought about, but it is a massive presidential assertion of authority that Congress has never provided him. the president says, you can't adopt a rule. You can't have a rule published in the Federal Register unless it has my signature on it. There is no statute that authorizes the president in that way. President Reagan's earlier executive order was quite careful to preserve the proposition that it was agencies acting and presidents advising. Back to slide 13, please. The powers that the president is given in Article 2 include being commander-in-chief of the military. We understand what that means. But in relationship to domestic agencies, what he gets to do is to ask for opinions of the people who actually have the duties to act. Just to ask for their opinions. It doesn't say he gets to act. What says he gets to act is that Section 8 of 12866. And that's going a step further than anything in the Constitution or anything in the statutes authorizes the president to do. For me, a major source of concern. So now slide 7, if you will. I think, in agreement with others up here, that the Regulatory Accountability Act has a good deal to say for it. Many provisions seem likely to draw support across the administrative law community. Keep going, and I'll let you read this stuff. Keep going, please. Again. Okay. There's a lot of sensible stuff in the Act. Now slide 8, please. Slide 8. A comparison between the House and Senate versions. Some reason for concern on the House side. The more elaborate procedures provided for can be, many of us think are, a recipe for obstruction, for providing opportunities for outsiders, basically to block the adoption of rules which they dislike through procedural devices. That's the John Dingell quote I showed you at the very beginning. And there's a questionable anti-lobbying procedure that's likely to engender side disputes. Well, did the agency in promoting its rule violate this anti-lobbying procedure? But on the whole, it's not a terrible bill. I understand why 2 Democratic senators, and there could have been more, agreed to support it. On the House side, look at all of that stuff. And back to slide 1. Back to slide 1, please. Ways to throw sand into the gears of regulation. Thank you.
All right, thank you to everyone. Professor Whittington started us off saying that he was going to offer a somewhat pessimistic view of congressional checks, or any checks, as a matter of fact, on the administrative state, and in particular that the non-delegation doctrine exists, but in name only, and is not meaningful in practice. And with that announcement of a pessimistic view, I was expecting perhaps more optimism from our other panelists, but I'm not sure I heard more optimism from our other panelists. But perhaps you'd like to take a few minutes to respond to what your co-panelists have said before we open it up to questions.
No, I'm happy to get to questions. It's pessimism all the way down.
I want to respond just a little bit to Peter on the Regulatory Accountability Act. It's a bipartisan bill, so everything in it is not something I love, but it should be something Congress should pass. I don't think this is not a hard one. to decide on. And if we wanted to have more...
You mean the Senate version?
The Senate version, yes. No, the bipartisan one. And it would have a lot more bipartisan support in a different Congress than it does today. A lot of compromises were made, as Peter demonstrated with that last slide. You really did have a lot of Democratic input on that, people who haven't co-sponsored it, that pushed it to more bipartisan land. I just don't, I know in this Congress we're not getting anything through, but this is the type of bill that's just common sense. Even Cass Sunstein almost fully endorsed it on his Bloomberg View piece, and I do really think it is something Congress should take up and pass soon.
I almost fully endorsed it, too.
Chris, is it fair to say that the Regulatory Accountability Act is mostly about measures to create greater transparency rather than the true substantive checks?
Yeah, I mean, well, yes and no. I mean, it's codifying, these best practices that the ABA has identified, and also the best practices that the White House has been using through OIRA review, for decades, through all presidents since Reagan, arguably before Reagan, and allowing for a little bit more judicial review. And one thing that I think, it's just very carefully drafted. One thing that I love about it is, as Peter was mentioning at the end, is it doesn't get rid of Chevron like a lot of other bills do, but it replaces our with Skidmore deference, a little bit less deferential standard. And that's particularly important when you're making rulemaking a little bit harder for agencies to do. If they've actually got to do more rigorous economic analysis, explain the reasons better and the like. The risk is if you make rulemaking too hard, and I'm stealing from Aaron Nilsson here, from a terrific piece he published in the Georgetown Law Journal, they will drift to agency guidance, right? If rulemaking is too tough, you go to guidance. And what does guidance get? Our deference. So if you keep Chevron in place, which encourages agencies to do rulemaking and more formal procedures, but you lessen our deference, you're trying to strike the right agency incentives so they continue to use rulemaking when it's appropriate and don't abuse the use of agency guidance. So that's just one example of a bipartisan compromise that actually resulted in a better piece of legislation.
And I don't disagree with that last point in the least. John Manning, an old friend and now dean of Harvard Law School, pointed out that there's really a significant difference in incentives between Chevron and our. If Congress passes a statute that is not carefully worded, and the evidence is in recent years they've known how to pass carefully worded, overworded statutes, 2,000 pages here, 300 pages there. But if Congress passes a statute that is not carefully worded and Chevron is in place, it knows what risks it is taking. That's in effect a delegation. Agencies don't suffer the same incentive when it comes to adopting rules, because they're in charge not only of what the rules will say, but what their interpretations will be. And consequently, our is well overstated.
So awesome, I got Peter Strauss to say we should get rid of our deference. This is my...
Replace it with Skidmore.
Oh, okay, I'll take that for me. I'll take that for now.
And if you look carefully at my writings, you'll find it there already.
Yeah.
Can I interject something here on our? Justice Thomas told this story on the occasion of the celebration of his 20th anniversary, 25th anniversary session to the court. And he was asked in an interview format how he got along with Scalia, and Justice Scalia, and he said, "Oh God, we were great friends, and it was a wonderful relationship." And he used to ask me, "Clarence, you're a Southerner. How come you don't hunt?" And I would say, said Thomas, "Nino, you're from New Jersey. How come you do hunt?" But the funnier story was, after an argument involving deference issues, our, of course, came up and Chevron came up. And at the end of it, Scalia leans over to Thomas and says, Clarence, I think that our decision may be one of the worst decisions ever rendered by the Supreme Court. And Thomas said to him, I think I understand what you're talking about. You wrote it, Nino.
All right, any further reaction to one another's comments? All right, then we'll take some questions. Go ahead, sir.
If we're not if we're not going to get Congress to go back to a 5-day work week or assume its proper Article 1 responsibilities anytime soon, like the panel's views about a partial remedy in some situations, which has been attempted in the state of Oregon not long ago, which is make the agency pay for the cost of its regulation, where it impacts only a few individuals to supposedly create a public good. In Oregon, by state initiative, a law was passed that basically applies just to real estate that is devalued through environmental regulation, that says the agency, the state government, has to pay for the cost of the regulation. Would that give agencies pause passing rules that may not be truly beneficial enough to justify the cost?
Anyone want to take that one on?
Well, if they, I mean, every rule costs something, and the ideal is, even if it's not always realized, is that the benefits will exceed it. But I don't know how you collect the benefits to help defray the costs. And I'm not sure an agency would do anything if it didn't have a way to defray the costs, even if the benefits were 100 times the cost.
If I understood the statement of the Oregon statute correctly, and I don't know the statute, it applies only in circumstances where a handful of individuals is affected.
Yes, that is correct. The idea behind it is unfair to put on the backs of a few individuals the burden of creating a public good that is for the benefit of all citizens. Therefore, the polity as a whole should compensate those individuals for creating such public good, which is they're forced to do so by regulation.
If we're really talking about individuals, you and me, I can see the argument for it. If we're talking about the one copper smelter in the state whose sulfur dioxide emissions poison everyone else in the state and maybe quite a few people to the east of there, but it will cost several $100 million for the smelter to control its sulfur dioxide emissions, I don't see the merit.
Anyone else? All right, let's go to the back microphone for the next question.
Yeah, thank you. So John Dingell's point on procedure is very prescient. Do you think there are any procedures that the current Congress could adopt to increase maybe expedience if it wanted to respond to the regulatory state, or accountability just on voting on more issues?
So I can jump in and share some thoughts on that. When I saw the quote, I mentioned to Keith, I'm like, this is exactly what a faculty meeting is like. It's so true, right? Whoever holds the procedure ends up winning the whole game. But so I think there are a number, obviously the legislative filibuster is something that perhaps we have to reconsider in the Senate. And I hate to say that as someone who, likes the institutionalist Senate, but the Senate's just not acting like a Senate, like the Senate has in decades past. And so I think maybe that's one procedure that we need to think more carefully about. The other is reauthorization. Actually give some teeth to it. These statutes, the Farm Bill is one of the few statutes where everyone comes to the table and reauthorizes every, 5 years? But lots of the organic statutes agencies have reauthorization provisions, and they're operating without them being reauthorized for a long time. We could say that they have to be reauthorized, similar to appropriations, and Congress could place some limits on that. And that way you get more lowercase l legislation coming out of oversight committees and more careful reconsideration. Those are a couple. There are lots of other ways that the Senate's been exploring, limiting time for debate and things like that. But those are really subsidiary to kind of the bigger questions of how to get legislation off the ground.
The last of those is easy to agree with, but one of my favorite authors these days observed in one of his writings that one of the things about the filibuster was that it encouraged moderation in legislation, and that taking it away from I think that was you, Chris. And
it is,
taking
yeah.
it away from
I like that I'm one of your favorite authors. I'll take that.
And that taking it away from the legislative agenda would simply be a way of encouraging more polarization in the legislature, which I think is not something we need.
All right, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Todd Gaziano from Pacific Legal Foundation. And I have a follow-up, Chris, really to your half praise, half disappointment on the Congress's reaction to the Congressional Review Act. I was honored to testify about 6 weeks ago in the House Judiciary Committee on the agency's failure to comply with the Congressional Review Act. And Brookings, for example, has published a study of, I think, 456, if I remember correctly, significant notice and comment rules published in the Federal Register that weren't submitted to Congress. That's the tip of the iceberg. And yet this administration, and I've had some communication with various levels, won't send them to Congress. And I have to silence my phone before I ask a question. The sage-grouse rule was one of the ones that I talked about in my testimony. The administration either can send it up and embrace it and threaten a veto, send it up, let Congress disapprove it, but the one thing it can't lawfully do is continue to enforce it and not send it to Congress. So how can we, and there are hundreds of other regulations this administration is enforcing against people that they now know are not lawfully in effect. How can we get the administration to either send these to Congress or stop enforcing them unlawfully?
Any ideas?
Well, the current administration is quite serious about deregulation. I would continue to raise the question as publicly as you can and get as many of your friends to raise it as publicly as you can and continue to put pressure on them. There's no reason in the world. I mean, the typical paradigm has been, all right, the agency takes advantage of an ambiguity and takes that as a delegation to do anything it wants. There's really no reason in the world why the agency shouldn't behave just the other way and say, no, I'm not going to do this because I actually don't have the authority because it hasn't been submitted or whatever. And I don't see any reason why the White House couldn't be persuaded, EPA couldn't be persuaded, FDA, whatever, FCC couldn't be persuaded to follow your very, very good idea.
Thank you. We'll sue if you can't convince them to do so.
I would just say, I think Naomi Rao at Awira would be, quite receptive. She's got a lot on her plate right now, though, so it might not be the highest of her priorities.
All right, yes, ma'am, at the back microphone.
So I'm just wondering if you can explain a little bit of the constitutional issue, if it's something that the Senate as well as the House version share, and if the solution to that is simply amending the Senate version to include presentment to the president, and if it's not a constitutional, if it isn't a constitutional issue and cannot be fixed by amendment, is not the answer an actual constitutional amendment? If this rises to the occasion of a constitutional amendment, which I know is a lot more work, but expediency shouldn't run over the constitutionality of the matter.
The constitutionality of the REINS Act you're referring
That's right.
to.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
My understanding is that that submission to the president is part of the act.
I understand that that's part of the act for one side and not the other. Someone brought up a couple of times yesterday that there was a constitutional issue and problem with the REINS Act, and I wanted that addressed here.
The constitutional problem that some people see, and as I said, I don't share it, is that is in effect a delegation concern that in adopting the REINS Act, Congress is adopting something of an equivalent of the one-house veto, which was disapproved in Chadha. Because if either house fails to adopt a resolution of approval, then the rule doesn't go into effect. And as I said, from my perspective, the way to view the act that neutralizes that problem is that it withdraws from all agencies the authority to enact rules that are have more than the defined level of impact. But then, again, from my perspective, what follows from that way of seeing the act is that what the agency has done is to submit a proposal for legislation. And when Congress and the President act on that proposal for legislation, it is legislation. and judicial review of it should be the equivalent of judicial review of legislation generally.
I would just add on that, a couple years ago, I used the REINS Act as a hypo on my final exam, after, in light of, Chadha, and I made the argument, Ron Levin did, and said, is this unconstitutional? And I think 1 out of 75 students was even willing to make the argument as unconstitutional. I find it to be a pretty weak one. As to the Senate and House version, I wasn't aware of that. If presentment's not required under the House version, that's obviously something they should fix. I don't think that should be an easy fix.
All right, yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Richard Belzer. I've worn different hats in 30 years doing this. The hat I'm wearing now is as a former OIRA economist. And just speaking of REINS and the Congressional Accountability Act, I would say, based on my experience, that either of them would fail from the perspective of their advocates, precisely because they have these hard thresholds for in and out to the different requirements. With a $100 million threshold, you will have umpteen $99 million rules. That problem isn't solvable. Back in the 12291 days, we accommodated it because OIRA was quite capable at the staff level of simply designating rules as major without having to go through the administrator to do it. That changed in 1993, and that made it very difficult. So agencies had very strong incentives to cut rules into small parts to keep them under the $100 million threshold and then do no analysis. Related to that, because there is a cost threshold in getting in, you give agencies an incentive to do no analysis at all, so it never learns whether it's above the $100 million threshold. Ignorance is bliss from the perspective of an agency.
All right, I guess the summary of that question is it too easy to evade?
So if that's the problem we have, that's a lot better problem than we have now, right? I mean, and I think you're right. You're definitely right. There's going to be some gaming, and it's a bipartisan piece of legislation, the Senate version, and there's no judicial review of the determination of whether it meets the threshold. But even under the threshold, even if it's not 100 million, the Regulatory Accountability Act still does implement a lot of the executive orders on cost-benefit analysis, not to the same degree as above 100 million. And so I'm happy to have that fight about agencies playing games with how much it actually costs or splitting rules up. That's a better fight than a fight of whether they should actually do any economic analysis at all in their rulemaking.
Any other comments on that?
If I understand the REINS Act correctly, it's the administrator and not the agency who determines what the impact of the rule will be, and that would operate as some kind of corrective as well.
Yeah, except like his point's really smart, right? Agencies decide what the rule is to start with, and Jennifer New and Jed Stiglitz does really great work on this to show how agencies like strategically split up rules so they fall under thresholds, or if they're already over the threshold, they dump more rules into that one rule, so they only have to do one. So there's a lot of gamesmanship there that will be had, and that actually already happens through OIRA review now.
All right, yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Lawrence Kogan. I serve in multiple capacities, including litigation counsel, regulatory counsel, and even nonprofit advocate.
Keep your voice up.
And I have worked with some of the gentlemen on the table, on the panel today, Mr. Gray and Mr. Strauss, on EU administrative law. You may recall back the report 10 years ago. I didn't notice anybody speaking of the Federal Information Quality Act or Data Quality Act as a possible response to the double deference that's given at the Chevron level dealing with science-related issues that underpin major federal regulations, meaning regulations that have a regulatory impact of over $500 million, far more than the $100 million threshold for cost benefit, and that which is mentioned in the REINS Act. Is there a reason why you haven't discussed this?
Time.
Well, I would, I may be wrong about this, but my understanding is it's not judicially reviewable, so it's therefore not enforceable.
Well, the ACIS seem to have a different opinion on that.
Who?
Administrative Conference. had an open-mindedness concerning the judicial reviewability of the Information Quality Act at the U.S. District Court level, assuming that Article 3 and prudential standing requirements and APA requirements were
Well,
met. So we're
I'm
talking
not going to
about
argue about that. Well, but let's get a final, ultimate resolution of it, because the problem is, you know, when I was in private practice years ago, and a statute would get passed, you know, like the Small Business Flexibility Act or whatever, the first thing you do was look at the last page to see whether you could get judicial review. And if you couldn't get judicial review, you didn't even bother to read the statute. So I think you've got to get that tamped down before it's gone. I mean, I know it's a great favorite of Jim Tosey, who's a great favorite of mine, and he's the author of it, I think. And it could be a very, very powerful tool if it were clearly and completely judicially reviewable.
Well, I believe it is, and having already reviewed that case law and published it in Washington Legal Foundation, I'd be happy to share with you my findings.
This isn't a complete response, but one of the relative strengths of the Senate Act, as I recall, is that it limits the claim to hearing to specific issues of scientific, technical, and the like fact that are shown to be in dispute. That reduces the sand in the gears potential considerably and points in the direction of real dispute, with agencies having some control of it. I would expect that judgment to be susceptible of review and to serve very much as a proxy, if you like, for the IQA.
Right. It goes directly to the science development and review processes, the selection of the peer review panels, the objectivity of the peer review panels, the actual conflicts of interest, both direct and indirect, involving the participants on the panel and the developers of the science. It's rather amazing when you dig deeply into it. You see that there are different standards for peer review at the NIH than there are in the Department of Defense for procurement purposes. So when you look at affiliations per institution, institutional conflicts, these are things that are unfortunately pervasive throughout the federal government, and therefore render the science susceptible to manipulation and suspect for purposes of later challenging the rulemaking, because if the science is determined not to have met the peer review standards of the Information Quality Act at a district court level, it is arguable that if a rulemaking challenge were pursued at the circuit court level, you would not get deference going to the agency. It would rather be given to OMB, because they are the promulgators of the IQA under formal Administrative Procedure Act notice and comment process.
Okay, thank you for
Thank you very much.
that more robust summary of what the act is about, since we did not get to it. Was there anyone else who wanted to comment on it?
Jim Tosey's been trying to get me to write or think about this for a long time, and I have not, and neither have most academics. So if it's something, shoot me an email. We can do a blog series and get diverse perspectives on it over at the Yale Journal Regulation blog. That's something that I think would be really fun.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And at the back microphone, yes, sir.
Sure. Roman Buehler with the Madison Coalition. There was some discussion of defects of the REINS Act. Obviously, it's subject to constitutional challenge. It's probably not going anywhere in the Senate. The $100 million threshold can be evaded by bureaucrats, and it probably doesn't apply to religious freedom or Second Amendment regulations, which could have a very low cost. So my question to the panel is, as some of you know, there is a constitutional version of the REINS Act called the Regulation Freedom Amendment that has been endorsed by the Republican National Committee with the approval of the White House, and has also been endorsed by resolutions passed in 26 legislative chambers. The idea being, if you get 2/3 of the states, Congress has always proposed, almost always proposed amendments when they see that 2/3 of the states are for it, like Bill of Rights. My question to the panel is, what do you think of the constitutional idea of of requiring congressional review rather than simply trying to do it in legislation?
Anybody prepared to address that?
Well, I'm a supporter of that effort, and I think it ought to continue, and it would be a great service if it could be achieved. But I would also say that the constitutional questions are a mystery to me if the legislation says agencies have no authority and authority to issue rules except with congressional approval. They don't exist except for congressional creation. They don't have any independent existence or power to tell Congress what to do. It's the other way around.
I guess I would just add, kind of similar to what I said about the Congressional Review Act in my initial remarks, that these types of procedures are creative ways to rein in the administrative state, but they really should not be replacing Congress's primary role to legislate. And I do worry if the movement for this does not also emphasize that point that Congress will have, because I like the idea of a populist movement to make Congress rethink its role in the administrative state, but I think it really needs to include the talking point that Congress needs to get back to legislating as well.
And Congress needs the incentive to write clear statutes. That kind of provision does not create it.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Good morning. My name's Joanne Young, and I have a perhaps rather practical question. Since I graduated from Georgetown Law in the 70s and have practiced in this city before federal agencies and departments, I've seen a marked transition from federal bureaucrats being public servants to essentially looking to interpret past regulations and interpret them and enforce interpretations really against the American people and their companies. My question is, what can this administration do to change their attitude toward get them back to being public servants, or to change the civil service laws in the Congress so that we can, in fact, change the administrative state, starting with the bureaucracy?
Okay, that's more a question of the culture of the deep state. So anybody want to take that on?
The deep state.
It's a serious challenge to influence the culture of the bureaucracy and make it more politically accountable. I mean, there is evidence, I think, that if presidential appointees come into executive agencies, they can have quite significant effects, but you have to get them in place, and they have to be organized and skillful at being able to try to manage the bureaucracy, but that can have real impacts. It's also true that Congress can affect that through some of the administrative oversight tools that it has available to it, and if Congress is focused, it can alter the actions of bureaucrats as well. I don't know if you gotta go so deep as to try to change civil service as such, as opposed to trying to use the tools that are more readily available.
One of the impacts of the senior executive service created during the Carter administration, and perhaps not anticipated by President Carter, has been significantly to increase the politicization, which is another way of saying the possibilities for political control at the policy setting levels of the federal bureaucracy.
So I've spent months interviewing agency officials, about their interactions with Congress and courts, and then after just reading Josh Chaffetz's book and kind of seeing how Congress can play a really powerful role here through oversight. Agencies are very responsive to concerns from individual members of Congress, congressional committees. One thing that's interesting I hadn't really focused on before is there's a pretty big pay gap between between bureaucrats and congressional staffers, to the extent that you got a lot of turnover on the Hill that is due in part because they get better jobs from federal agencies and from other people, but also from federal agencies. And I think that's something to rethink. If you can get congressional staffers on the committees longer, I think there's a chance that they can play a more meaningful role in checking the administrative state.
All right.
If I just could mention, too, I think part of the problem it's become worse because of the unionization of the federal workforce.
All right. Thank you, ma'am. And at the back microphone. Yes, sir.
Hi, Gary Lawson, Boston University School of Law, and I have a not even slightly practical question. This is for Keith Whittington. No, Keith,
Excellent. I'm good at non-practical questions.
Right. No, I haven't seen the Notre Dame piece, but I did look at the Penn J-Con law. I want to even have a nice little footnote on it coming out later. You'll like that. When you were surveying 19th century case law on delegation, I recall that you found a very, very modest invalidation rate. Was it like 8% or 10%?
Yeah.
I remember the exact number. Is that right?
Yeah, in that ballpark, a little bit higher. But
Right. If today, in non-delegation challenges, there was an 8 or 10% invalidation rate, my colleagues would have coronaries. And the people like me who don't want to throw sand in the gears, but want a fleet of cement trucks coming in, one after another, dumping their loads. Okay. We would be giddy with delight. I'm wondering what is the baseline for not taking a non-delegation doctrine seriously? And then the corollary to that is, in, say, 1880, what sorts of statutes were regarded as raising non-delegation issues versus the kinds of things that today were the baselines century and a half ago comparable to the baselines today, where what I call goodness and niceness statutes don't even raise eyebrows. So just
Right.
sort of what's the baseline for evaluating
Right.
what we should take as a serious issue?
Yeah, I think it's a fair concern, right? I mean, so what would we look at and think of as being a success in terms of an aggressive non-delegation doctrine? And our follow-up piece in Notre Dame sort of carries the data set through and looks at what was happening in the 20th century after the New Deal as well. And you're still getting cases that are being struck down, but all that's happening at the state level, right? So a lot of the action of courts actually invalidating stuff is state courts invalidating stuff. And partially that's because I think the state courts actually have been a little more aggressive throughout their history than the federal courts have been. In part that's because also I think state legislatures are a little more crazy than Congress is. And so there actually are examples that seem way more out there than what you get out of Congress. And it's also true that across history there have been a wider range of kinds of delegations that occur at the state level than what you get at the federal level. So as I noted a while ago, state courts for much of the 19th century was extremely skeptical about state legislatures delegating significant policymaking authority to the people in the context of various kinds of referenda, and like state courts would talk about how the people aren't nearly competent enough to actually make law. And so it'd be crazy to delegate any kind of significant lawmaking power to them. And so they struck those kind of things down. On the other hand, if you want to authorize a barber commission to regulate barbers, courts have generally been totally fine with that because, of course, they're experts and they can make the right call.
All right, thank you. One more question we have time for.
I'm Mike Doherty. A quick comment. The previous lady talked about the culture, and Professor Walker. I'd like to talk to you later about the fact I have testified with House Oversight. We did set up a hearing a few years ago, and we FOIA'd later the unbelievable pushback from the regulatory side behind the scenes, which required FOIA, and just bringing up the topic of an agency's behavior in a congressional hearing. So it's quite interesting. The pushback that you rise up is astounding. The reason I stood up for the question, though, was being in the private sector and in medicine for 30 years, I find this kind of like an autopsy when really it should be surgery. And yesterday we talked about a little bit about the public not knowing, and Mr. Gray also brought up today, the education of the public. And basic civics books don't have this in it. And this has been going on for centuries. So how would you write the first two sentences of the administrative state in a civics book after you're done talking about the three branches of government? Because I think until the public understands, Congress very much has their legs tied together.
Well, you know, that's... If we knew how to make this understandable to the general public, I think we wouldn't be here, would we?
That would be great.
So it's a very good question, and I don't know the answer, whether you I mean, you know, there is the example of horse massage. You know this one, don't you?
No.
That in many states, at least in Arizona, you can't massage a horse unless you are a full-time vet. But there's no requirement that you get certified to massage a human being.
So
I'm not touching that, but thank you for that. Insightful.
let me try your 2 sentences, if I may.
Okay.
The Constitution of the United States creates three principal branches, three principal sources of authority: the Congress for legislating, the President for executing law, and the judiciary for assessing the legality of government conduct. The Constitution also authorizes Congress to establish bodies subordinate to all three that carry out the functions for which those three are responsible.
So I want to get back to, Professor Metzger, Julie Metzger was here yesterday and talking about our Harvard Law Review Forward, and obviously Justice Gorsuch had some swipes at that, which were fun and good-hearted, and I'd love to have Justice Gorsuch criticize my work someday, hopefully. But if you read Professor Metzger's forward, it paints a really different picture of American governance than I would ever like. One where the bureaucracy reigns supreme and the political branches follow and lead. And that's a very scary picture, but for my students, when I teach them, introduce them to the administrative state, they like it. Expertise. It's technical, it's not political. And I think one reason they like it is they've grown up in an age of a dysfunctional Congress that doesn't do the legislative work that it needs to. And this is the message we've got to get out, is that we have three branches of government, and each branch plays an important role. And the administrative state is here, and it's not going anywhere. But its proper role is that it's subject to both political branches and not just the president.
And to wind up with one comment on the Congress, Boyden, I think, was very generous in crediting members of Congress with 2.5 days of work.
You're just dying to get that one in, weren't you? Okay, thank you.
All right, please join me in thanking our panel.